Lead balloons.
Lead balloons.
The alchemy of unpopular opinions.
Unpopular opinions.
Yeah, I feel a little spicy today, so all bets are off.
And I know that you're out to get the ladies.
We're not encouraged to think critically.
Life is hard. It's supposed to be hard.
Oh my god. That's hilarious. Busted.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to our podcast, Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. And today we are going to talk about how we don't give a damn about hell. The title is Not Giving a Damn About Hell. Trent, hot takes.
Hot takes on that topic of not giving a damn about hell. I wish I could actually, yes, that is the truth now, but sadly that has not been the case historically for me, which we'll get into.
Yes, we will. Well, let's dive into it first. I want to talk about hell houses, and you had mentioned you've never been to a hell house, but you have some experiences with some skits or something like that, right?
Yes. Yeah, I've been to my share of haunted houses, but not to the Hell House, which is directly a kind of a Christian themed take on a horror haunted house. So when I was in high school, it was my junior year. I remember this vividly. The beginning of my junior year in high school, I had joined. I started going consistently to a youth group, and they did this program on Saturday nights. I think they were doing it every Saturday night. And it was called The River, and it was like an evangelistic outreach. And so you had the youth there and then friends that we had brought and stuff like that to try to get them converted. And they would do skits, they would do music, they would do a sermon, all these kinds of things. And they were doing a skit. And basically the long and short of the skit is it's got these kids in a car and they're drinking, these teenagers, and they get in a car accident. Yeah, exactly. The tropes, right? Drinking, driving. Oh, man. So they're drinking and driving, they get into a wreck, they all die,
Yeah.
And they go up and they stand before God, and they're in this receiving line. Mm-hmm, and they stand, of course, that's how it's going to be. We all know. They're standing before, they come to the line and they stand before God. And I don't know if the person playing was supposed to be playing God or St. Peter, whoever, but they're sorting people out. You're going to go, did you believe in Jesus? And they're like, yes, I did, and send him this way. And then there was another couple people who did not believe in Jesus, and they were sent off to hell. And when they get sent off to hell, they're shrieking and writhing and being pulled away. And I remember watching that. It's so crazy because it was a dramatization, but it made me think about hell in ways that I never had before. And I was just thinking about this today in preparation for this podcast. I'm I can't believe how influential that was on my life. Not just that alone, but that was in a long line of things I had been taught about hell. But somehow in that moment, it switched something on for me. It flipped a switch, and it made me really earnest about my faith in ways that I hadn't been before. It was dramatically important.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So all the stars aligned, and
yes.
Trent's whole body was a full body experience. You dribbled a little pee while you're watching this, and now your faith goes to the next level. It ratchets up thanks to this.
Absolutely, big time.
Okay.
Yeah. So why don't you dish?
So you may know something about this because there was a church in Tulsa that put on this super huge hell house, and they called it The Nightmare. And it was a huge production. It made national news at times, and they had this massive warehouse, and they created scenes of mostly people getting killed. There was a drunk driving scene. There was always a suicide scene, and it usually was some teenage girl, you'd walk into a room and it'd be so creepy, and you walk in there and there'd be this room of all these baby names written on the walls and lines written through them, and something about it. You just put putting things together. Here's an underage girl who's pregnant who had an abortion or something like that. You're just and then all of a sudden a light would go in the corner and you'd see someone rocking, and then they pull up a gun and like blood and stuff would come out of the back of their heads, and they used like
Ugh.
Hollywood like stuff. And I mean, you would be sitting there, and someone was probably at top spraying you with a water gun, but you'd feel like something got on you. It was awful. And then you go through all this thing, and the very end scene is like this. You're walking, and you're just like going, oh my gosh, what is all this? And the last scene is you're walking into the black room, and then a light shines, and this cross turns, and there's the most bloody, mangled Jesus you've ever seen. It just puts, like Jim Caviezel in The Passion of the Christ, to shame the amount of just like blood that's dripping and he's just heaving, and then you walk out, and then you're just in the air, and there's like 20 pressure sales tactic people coming at you, trying to get you to convert. And I one year my roommate went to that church and was involved, and not everything they did was awful, but this was pretty awful, I thought. And they I got to like talk to some of the people at the end, and they would like keep tallies with a pin on their hand how many people would like say the prayer. One year, and this made me so mad, I was a youth pastor at the time. One year they did a whole theme on child molestation. And there was Chester the child molester was the main like through line through this whole thing, and you had all these little kids in robes like walking around, and they were just like so irresponsible with what they were intentionally trying to evoke in terms of pain, fear, trauma. And it just makes me think of I think about like even in our justice system, if a police officer uses any kind of fear or intimidation tactics to get a confession, it's not admissible in court. That's not even admissible in court. Yet we think that that's what helps us create salvation. And I, even as a young person, I just remember just going like, I really don't like being a part of all of this. Hell.
Blech. Yeah.
How you feeling over there?
Rot gut, man. That brings back memories, man. Oh, it's just so rough. Yeah. But I mean, back in the day, I didn't really think too much of it. I just thought it was fairly normal. Yeah, I wouldn't have critiqued it too much back in the day, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, when your belief system is that eternal torment or eternal pleasure and joy, that's the scale. The stakes are so fucking high. Yeah. And when the stakes are so high, you can justify almost anything, right? The ends justify the means. I would even say,
Joel, I mean, I think given what hell is purported to be by many evangelical Christians and Catholics and so forth, I don't think people do enough. I mean, that's mild. That's a mild measure. I mean, people should be running naked through the streets, screaming with signs saying, "Repent and believe, for the great judgment is coming." If it's as bad as that, and it does make you wonder, then how seriously do people really take it if they're not willing to take extreme measures? Hell House, the nightmare. That's not an extreme measure, I don't think, at all, given what they say.
We're gonna dive into this, everyone. Talk about hell and how we at this stage don't give a damn about it, but a lot of people do, or a lot of people are trying to hold on to it.
Yeah.
And I would argue the primary reason people don't do more is because they're also realizing that the majority of the Bible isn't about hell. It's about love and grace and these sorts of things. So how do you fit these two incompatible pieces into the same puzzle? Sorry, I had a little burp there. Trent.
Mute button.
Yeah. Give us a little rundown on your understanding of how the Bible describes and defines hell. We want to get into the meat of this. Hell defined.
Yeah, so we're going to get a little bit academic here. So, first of all, the doctrine of hell that we've inherited in Western Christianity, this is not something that is clearly articulated in the Bible, right? I mean, it's something that's been cobbled together by theologians across the centuries. So, but we have some key words that were used, and we're just gonna. This is a very cursory glance at it, but hopefully enumerating some of these things will be helpful. So in the Old Testament, which does not have a fleshed out doctrine of the afterlife, it's really pretty undefined. In the Old Testament, there's generally a belief that's seen in the Old Testament that when you die, you die. Your body goes down to a place called Sheol, which is a Hebrew word. And this is kind of a vague and hazy place for departed spirits. We're not sure. They don't really say a whole lot about what's going on there. It's just kind of where you go when you die. There's a passage, Genesis chapter 37, 35. This is in the midst of the story of Jacob and his sons, and how when Joseph was basically, his brothers schemed to off Joseph, or at least get rid of him, and they made it look like he'd been torn to pieces or something, and they took his garments to his father Jacob. And Jacob says this, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son." So that's just kind of an offhand comment about, he's saying, I'm going to go down to the grave, going to go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. So there's Sheol, and there's other passages that I could rattle off that you probably don't care about that's there in the Old Testament. Now, yeah, but there's not much that needs to be said, because there just isn't much that's said in the Old Testament about it. Okay, now in the New Testament, we have the word Hades, and we have, or in Greek, Hades. So it's a Greek word, it's a Greek concept. Many of us know about Hades, the Greek god of the underworld. So there's a long tradition of this word before it even shows up in Koine Greek in the New Testament. Now, Hades is also a place for the dead, where the dead go. I believe it's mainly referred to as like a place, not your body dies, but then your soul goes to Hades. Now, this is used in multiple places in the New Testament, and I'll give a brief reference here. There's the story in Luke 16 of the rich man. Jesus tells a story of a rich man and who lived sumptuously, and then Lazarus, who was a poor man who was at his gate and covered with sores and all these kinds of things. And the rich man and the poor man died, and it says the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom, and the rich man also died and was buried. And then it says about the rich man in Hades, he lifted up his eyes, being in torment, and saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried out and said, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus so that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I'm in agony in this flame." So the reading that I did about Hades is, it's not generally thought of, at least in like the Greek context, not generally thought of a place of torment. But in this story, Jesus picks it up as a place where the rich man is being tormented. It's implied that there's some kind of flame there. So he's in pain. And you'll also note, I think what's important here is kind of the parabolic nature of this story. I mean, probably not intended to take it literally. He looks up and he can see, like, far away, he can see Lazarus, and he starts to try to have this conversation with Lazarus, and I think you've got Abraham there talking with them. So it's just kind of this dreamy, dreamlike story. Not
Absolutely.
Really probably intended to be taken literally. Not intended to be taken literally.
Yeah, I want to jump in there. That was one of the first passages I remember taking in hermeneutics, which is your basic course for all theology majors. And hermeneutics, you can take multiple courses of it, and it can go deep and wide. But this was an introductory course where you're learning how to interpret sacred scriptures. Mm-hmm. And this was the first thing that we studied, and the question that was posed to us as these young evangelical Pentecostals and charismatics was, is the story of the rich man Lazarus told as a real thing, like literally true, or is this a parable? And it blew all our minds to think that we were allowed as interpreters to take this as a parable, and to go like look for clues in storytelling, as the first century rabbi might tell a story. This is clearly parabolic. And so like it's so interesting that you bring that up, and I'm just having flashbacks to going like, oh right, most people have no idea what they're doing when they read the Bible.
Exactly. It's just understanding the literary context as well as the context within the Gospel of Luke, and seeing how it's used should clarify some things. So anyway, that's one iteration of the word Hades. It makes its appearances elsewhere. Okay. So then moving on. So we have Sheol in the Old Testament. We have Hades in the New Testament. And then we also have the word Gehenna. Now, Gehenna means the Valley of Hinnom. This was an area outside of Jerusalem. Now, Gehenna was really kind of seen, taking some of this from listening to Bart Ehrman, a New Testament scholar, but the Valley of Hinnom outside of Jerusalem was considered like a forsaken and desecrated place outside the city. It's might have been a place where the bodies were thrown, where you might be there if you hadn't received like a proper burial. There was ancient
practices of like child sacrifice there.
Yeah, Topheth and sacrificing children there. So it had a very sordid, ugly, nightmarish past. So the association obviously would have been very negative for any of Jesus's audiences, for sure. So we have this word Gehenna, which is an Aramaic word. And now what's interesting about this is the word Hades is not translated. It's just given to us as it's transliterated. We get Hades in our English Bible translations. But whenever you see Gehenna, it will be translated as hell. Now, the problem is really the concept of hell had not been, was still inchoate. It was going to be growing into something throughout the successive centuries. But at that point in time, there was no doctrine of hell. And so when you translate Gehenna as hell, basically you're not giving your readers the opportunity to dive in and figure out what's being said when he says Jesus is not saying, when he says Gehenna, he's not saying hell in the sense that we understand the word as it's used in the 21st century today in our English translations. He's referring to, I think, more than just a place with all of the layers of meaning there. He's using it figuratively, but he's not saying hell. He's saying Gehenna. And that would have resonated in very specific ways with his listeners. And so I think that's a real unfortunate it's an uncourageous and dishonest, I think, translation choice that's being made there.
It's lazy is what it is. It's lazy.
That's right.
And it's revisionist history. It's the future projecting its ideas that are, as we'll talk about, influenced by so many other things. The idea of hell centuries later is being thrust back, pushed back, almost like the square peg pushed through the round hole. Just like this is now what Jesus is talking about, what we believe today.
Yes. So it's like my English professor said in college, it's anachronistic. So the concept of hell was something that grew in time, but you're thrusting it back into a first century context, and in which there wasn't that concept yet. Now, the concept of judgment and the concept of fire, like in, I'm going to reference this very quickly too. Matthew 10, one of the places where it's used is Matthew 10:28. And Jesus says, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in Gehenna." Okay. Now, what exactly does he mean there? I don't know. It doesn't sound great. I mean, even if it's not hell, it doesn't sound
negative.
Great. The Lord destroying the body and soul. But notice, I mean, Joel, when he says that, does this give people the right as interpreters to then spin off a full-fledged doctrine of eternal punishment when Jesus speaks somewhat cryptically about him who can destroy body in hell destroy soul and body in Gehenna? I mean, there's a definite literary effect there, and it's also a little bit cryptic, I think.
Intentionally, I think.
Yeah.
I read that figuratively, and as many people who combat the traditional view of hell would say today, even our friend we've critiqued, Jordan Peterson, would say, like, hell, everyone knows hell exists because we see it today. We can see it happening in slums. We can see it happening in refugee camps where they don't have like clean water. We can see it happening in where there's organized crime that is oppressing, entire groups of people. And so the idea of hell that Jesus is referring to an actual place that people have heard stories of horrors, and that like resonates with any human being who's experienced pain in life. Like anyone can look at a situation in their life and go like, that was hell. That was hell when someone I loved died and I felt the pain of that. That was hell when my brother or my sister went through that situation. That was hell, when my parents got divorced. Or you can hear those kinds of stories.
Yeah. And I mean, listen, I don't know exactly what he was saying. If he was attempting to kick off some doctrine of that we would say is hell, or if he was just simply trying to accentuate his point by saying, if you don't do these things, I mean, we all know that a rhetorical strategy is to sort of hyperbolize and to over accentuate something to make your point. Maybe that's what he was doing. It still doesn't sound very nice, but does it give people the prerogative to then conclude that there is a place where you go upon death, where you're burned, where you'll be tortured eternally? I don't think it can be drawn from there. Now, there are other passages that speak maybe more definitively about it, for sure. But just that one alone, I don't think gives you that warrant. Yeah.
And I would argue that most don't, even in the New Testament. Is still a very underdeveloped idea.
That's the afterlife.
The afterlife is still very fuzzy.
Yes.
Like, this is where I'm like, read the Old Testament, guys. Jews wrote the New Testament as well. And they were relying on the understanding of their Hebrew ancestors. They weren't out to create brand new doctrines that popes would talk about centuries later. That's not what was on their minds. They weren't trying to inform medieval perspectives, and certainly not trying to add in their mind some futuristic country called America where people can write books about like Left Behind and people being dragged off after they drank some beer in a car wreck. That's not in their minds. They have a very different mindset, and that's where interpretation. It's like it's a hard thing. You have to really put yourself in the mindset of a basically unknowable people group. We don't know enough about first century Judaism and these authors of the Bible to know for sure anything. That start there, and we are making best guesses to try and figure this out.
I think that's a brilliant point. I mean, there's so much that we don't know and perhaps cannot know about who the people were who were writing these things, what they were intending exactly with them. There's just a lot that we don't know. And the other thing, too, Joel, is I remember there was a radio program back in the day, The Bible Answer Man, with Hank Hanegraaff, and I think a lot of people see the Bible as a book of answers. Yeah. And, I came to my theological studies with the background of studying English literature. And one of the things I learned from studying literature is when you dig into literature, one of the things that you start to realize is it is more elusive than you can ever hope or dream, especially the greatest literature. I mean, Shakespeare is impenetrable to the interpreter. It's so beautiful and vague and obscure and powerful and all these things, but it will not be tamed. And I think that I would say that about the Bible is you go to it thinking you're going to find answers. Maybe you can, but great literature forces just as many questions on you as it does answers, as seen in the hundreds upon hundreds of denominations that have resulted by people who come to the scripture with their own presuppositions. So it's not, I see it as an intractable book if you're going to it with the desire to formulate hardcore doctrine. It can move you. It can anger you. It can comfort you. It can do a lot of things, but settle age-old questions I don't think it can do. Neither can Dostoevsky.
Correct. And I don't think it was trying to, but it's our kind of Western perspective that wants to go back. And again, we've not done a podcast on inerrancy, but I can't wait to tear that monster down because it is at the root of so many bad beliefs in
Yeah.
So this leads me to this idea.
Yeah.
I'm thinking back. I got to do a tour in the Vatican and got to see the Sistine Chapel. Have you ever been there?
Yes, I was there a little over 20 years ago. Yeah.
Wow, young lad, you were.
Yes. That's right.
I was there about, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago, 6-7 years ago, and it was gorgeous and I loved it, but I've always been enthralled with the later painting that Michelangelo did that was put above the altar, The Last Judgment. And it was very controversial, as Michelangelo was typically poking little political tigers in their cages. But it's basically this idea of the final judgment. It kind of follows the parable of the separation of the sheep and the goats. There's Jesus at the center, and there's those who go up to heaven, and the damned being poured down to hell. And of course, all of this is being influenced. We're talking 1500s here. This is Renaissance Reformation time period. So this is literally 1500 years past when these books that are inspiring these ideas were written. And I'm sure you've learned in all your Bible classes just how wrong a lot of people in the 1500s got the Bible, because they only had access to so much information.
Right.
And so I'm just curious, what is your view of how Western Christianity's doctrine of hell has developed and what it looks like today?
Yeah, I mean, well, it really has taken on a life of its own, and has added to the mythology of hell. I remember reading Dante's Inferno in high school, and I remember that had a tremendous impact on me. Obviously, it called to mind many things I'd read in the Bible, but it makes its own contributions as well, and it lives in people's imaginations in a very powerful way. So, I mean, I don't know if I can make a big broad statement about how it has things have developed regarding hell in the past 500 years or even since the first century, but the concept of hell lives very powerfully in our collective soul, our collective imagination as a culture. I mean, I think about, let's say, a lot of heavy metal music in its sort of godforsakenness. If you listen to some preachers in the 80s, they just despised and warned about heavy metal music, but you can't imagine heavy metal music without the dark side, without some kind of conversation with biblical text, right? I mean, Black Sabbath, right? Black Sabbath. And you think about one of their songs, one of my favorite Black Sabbath songs, War Pigs, in which they use lots of biblical imagery in there. Talk about generals gathered in their masses, just like witches at black masses, and they talks about Satan laughing spreads his wings and judgment and all these. I mean, that fills our imagination as much as people think that we've secularized. The amount of appearances that this kind of stuff makes in visual arts, in movies, in music. I think about Nirvana's song, "Where Do Bad Folks Go When They Die? Who Don't Go to Heaven Where the Angels Fly?" So this is just such a huge part of our culture. Halloween, the whole horror genre. I mean, what do you think? I mean, do you think that resonates with you?
Yeah, I do agree that you're kind of touching on the mythology and how it's kind of taken on a life of its own. And
yes.
Whether you're talking about comic books, in that imagination, you see that show up in the characters like Constantine, who's pulls from a name from the first Christian empire that made Christianity legal for the first time.
Yeah,
and here's this character who's kind of like this. You're stuck between the angels and the demons. You talk about movies like Hellraiser, or
right. That's right. Yes.
Or if you've ever seen Event Horizon, which is when I first saw that with Lawrence Fishburne, it terrified me. And I agree that hell has taken on a life of its own, and there's something that clearly resonates with people. I don't think it could have taken on a life of its own if there wasn't something in our human nature and our human experience that would say there's something to that. There's something to that. The question is, what is it? And does it necessarily mean that there is this final judgment for people? And because the moment you start really like thinking about that and start describing who goes, who doesn't, what's the measurements and the standards, and it all begins to break down very quickly as absurd that we're talking about my next door neighbor because, you know, he's a great dad, he pays his taxes, but he didn't say this prayer, so he's going to hell forever, where demons are going to be like poking him with pitchforks, or I don't know, he's just going to be. He's going to be eaten by little crabs. All, you know, worms are going to be crawling inside out of his guts because he didn't say this prayer, and that's what makes sense to me. You know, it's just like once you start like scratching the surface and getting below, it's like, okay, this is like nonsense. However, on the surface, I do think there's something that resonates with us going. And to me, what I think it is, oh yeah, there's some really awful shit that happens in our plane of existence. Like the world has some pretty messed up stuff. There are some people who do horrendous things. There's people who suffer horrendous traumas. There are stories that are hellish. And I think to me that's one of the things that keeps the mythology alive, is because everyone knows there's some truth to this. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish that we could get to the bottom of it. I think that your hypothesis is sound, or at least promising, and I think that there. Well, I mean, it remains a hypothesis because we don't know exactly how these things started moving forward, but for certain, I think you're right about that. That people's experiences of hellishness in this world certainly contribute to that. But I would also add to that, you know, I think they say we're one of the few, if not, we might be the only species that knows we're going to die, and we tend to fear death for good reasons. You know, it's a survival tactic, is to try to stay alive, but we fear death. Well, I mean, it seems like, I mean, it's the all-time great racket, right? Is to create a story about judgment in the afterlife, and then to offer the means by which people can escape that. That's like a great racket, because what could be worse than to die and to then be tortured eternally? I mean, that is a exceedingly powerful story. And if you don't know how to harness that, then you shouldn't be in the religion business. You shouldn't be in the intimidation, coercion business. That's the greatest racket that has ever been invented.
That's hilarious. I mean, maybe that's why I'm not a pastor anymore, because I stopped using that years ago, and tried to believe that compassion and love would be compelling enough. But as we know, cult leaders, religion's a much better world for cult leaders than it is for people who care to inspire selflessness. This is where I want to lead you, my friend. What does hell produce? This idea, think about the broad picture of a traditional hell. Of course, for those out there who know a bit about this, there's different ways of looking at hell. The traditional view is eternal torment, but there are some people who see something called annihilationism or conditional hell, where the soul is actually destroyed and it's no longer eternal torment, but it's a judgment that just ends your consciousness. I don't know, your soul's, whatever it may be. I'm just curious for you, what does hell produce? And I would like you to kind of talk about your personal experience first, about what hell produced for you, and then, you know, also share from a more philosophical perspective what you think hell produces generally in the public.
Well, I think there's great pragmatic value to telling people there's a hell, because I do think, just empirically, that it has and can produce good behavior. Like, in quotation marks, right? Short-term good results where people avoid they do the things they're supposed to do and avoid the things that they're supposed to avoid. And that was the case for me. Listen, I and I'm not the only person. That people who know me well know that I have a sensitive soul, and I think I was very impressionable in this way. And I became very fearful of hell at a young age and took it very seriously. And then I think in high school, especially like after seeing that skit, it had a profound impact on me. And it made me want to be the best Christian that I could be. Again, I wanted to be that Sermon on the Mount Christian. I wanted to avoid the bad stuff and do the good stuff. And that's fine. But then you have to ask the question, what are your motivations? Why are you doing good things? Are you only doing good things because you think that the result is going to be you go to heaven and avoid hell? Mm-hmm. That's somewhat transactional. And I think that it's all transactional, and it reduces. I think it does away. It abolishes any integrity of action that people might have. And that was looking back. I think it was like 10, 12 years ago, and I really started leaving this stuff behind. I looked at my behavior and I thought, I don't know if that was the authentic Trent. I think some of that was, but how much of my behavior as a teenager and in my 20s was motivated simply by a desire to avoid hell? And that really bothered me. That really, really bothered me, because I do think now that I behave the way that I do because I want to be a good person. I want to be treated well. And I hope that other people will, that I'll mind people and they'll mind me. That's a deeper conversation about morality, but Joel, my experience, and we've talked about this before in podcasts and stuff, but I was deeply shaped by a belief in hell. And I don't think it was a great thing. I think that it produced in some ways, a fearful personality in which I was just simply doing things to get away from judgment. It's not a good feeling, And you look at your relationship with God and you're like, boy, am I just doing things for you because I'm afraid of you? I mean, people talk about the fear of the Lord being like the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And it's like, that's terrible. That's pathological, man. That fear produces knowledge. Ugh. So, yeah.
Yeah, I hear that as well. I mean, I do think that there are some nuances around that word fear, and a better translation could be could be
reverence,
awe, or reverence. But
sure,
you're right. We didn't change it. We kept it, and we liked it in the camps that we were in. Me personally, I didn't really have a lot of personal fear of hell. I was afraid of demons. I was terrified that demons might show up in my bedroom, or blood might come down from the wall, or I don't know. Yeah. And I have a vivid memory of being 16 in my bedroom, and probably heard some stupid, my circles didn't tell ghost stories. They told demon stories, and they were usually involving some famous preacher who was Smith Wigglesworth or whatever, and they knew how to manhandle a demon. I don't know. But one night I was just so scared that, oh my God, there's demons in here. I bet there is. Yeah. And I remember saying out loud, Satan, if you're real, I dare you to show yourself. And I was like, please don't. And I was standing in my bed 2 a.m. I rebuke you in the name of Jesus. And it was just it was a terrifying experience for me. I was never really motivated to that I was ever going to go to hell. Wasn't worried about that. But when I hear you talk about the sensitivity, your sensitivity, can you just describe for me a little bit deeper? I hear you talking about how you feel like it messed with your motivations and even your ability to be authentic. But now that you're past all that and you've kind of let go of some of that, but it still sounds like it has some tender spots. Can you describe for people what this doctrine and how it was expressed left some marks on you?
Yeah, well, I think that I feel anger about it because I feel like there were wasted years in which I didn't take risks and didn't explore and didn't take serious my desires in life because I was made to feel awful about them. I was made to feel unclean or impure or whatever about just my authentic self. And losing a lot of time to, instead of experiencing peace and joy and happiness, feeling fear. God, did I lose my salvation? Dealing with sleepless nights and conversations with pastors about him. How do I know if I'm a real Christian, and these kinds of things? Making a fool of myself, doing door-to-door witnessing, and either ruining potential friendships or preventing myself from becoming friends with really good people. These were lost times that I can't get back because of that shit that I was taught. And then there's also the sense of, I think being told these things by people, and you'd like to think that we were taught this by people who were well-meaning, but there also might be people who taught us these things because they realized it's a great motivator for this person. This person takes it seriously. It's changing their behavior. Maybe whoever's teaching it thinks it's really true, or maybe they don't, but they realize that there's great results. And I just think it's a terrible thing not to take seriously what you're teaching people, particularly younger, impressionable people who aren't capable of having debates yet and these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. You're teaching them things, and if you don't know that they're true, I mean, if hell isn't true and you're telling people, you're traumatizing people.
Yep.
There's no debate in my mind. You're traumatizing people. How dare anybody tell impressionable young people that you could go to hell if you don't either believe these things or you don't do these things, you'll go to hell. If that doesn't exist, you've just done a horrible thing, in my opinion. I wish people would just stop doing it. Yeah, hopefully more and more are stopping.
I do think there's
Does that answer your question?
It does. And I wanted to touch on your passion there because it comes from, I think, a place of grief. I hear some grief there, some loss, and this is your life.
Yeah.
Quick pivot. I don't want to spend too much time here.
Yeah, sure.
But when we're talking about what hell produces, a lot of people will talk about this as like creating justice.
Yeah.
And the need to balance the scales, so to speak. But just a short little anecdote, a lot of research has been done recently, and we see this show up a lot in the world of education, public education in particular, about what's called retributive justice, or restorative justice versus retributive justice. And so instead of like punishment, there's a restorative way of, if a child, instead of like sending just kids to suspension or whatever it may be that the schools have, that they have a process that actually brings them into a circle with whatever the behavior that they did, whether it's vandalism or bullying, and that forces them to then be responsible and accountable, and there's conversation with other peers, and it actually is far more effective. In fact, you can just Google it. The school, there's a pilot school, I think, in Oakland that was done years ago, and it reduced the suspensions like by 87% or something crazy like that. And then the whole ISD adopted it and used this methodology, and I think there's a lot in Chicago that's happening as well. But why do you think Christians continue to hold on to, and it's not just Christians, I want to be fair, there's also other religions who do this, there's other people who aren't of faith and they just have political ideologies and they also think this way. Why do you think people like this continue to hold on to a story of retributive justice in the face of such evidence?
Yeah. Well, I would say that at the emotional level, it satisfies our need for revenge. And we've all had the experience when something wicked or just mean or cruel happens to us. It's like we want to get back at that person. We want to hit him back, or we want to cut him off, or we want to go find him and take care of him. That's that raw, and it's a raw, real, and powerful human emotion. But do we want to pursue policy based upon the emotions that we have right there in the moment? I don't think so, but I think it satisfies our need for revenge. And I think also, the Bible, as much, and you can elaborate on this, but there's a lot of good stuff on forgiveness and releasing people and redemption, all these kinds of things. But starting from the Old Testament, the whole sacrificial system with all the blood being spilled and the aroma of the barbecue going up to God so that he can forget about our sins. And then at the center of Christianity is the crucifixion, in which theories of atonement, like substitutionary atonement, basically more or less say that God forgives us and accepts us because the blood of a human sacrifice, namely his son, has been spilled. And yet there's other passages that talk about, Father, forgive them for they know not what they're doing, and other times when we're enjoined to just simply forgive people. But as long as Christians hold on to the notion that forgiveness requires, like a person being made right requires like the spilling of blood, there's a sense that when something wrong happens to another human being, there's like a rent in the universe. It's like a rip in the fabric of the universe. And if you don't right that wrong by and I'm not talking about righting in terms of restorative justice, where you try
make
to
amends,
inspire people to make restitution. Here we're talking about like eye for eye, tooth for tooth. There's a sense if we don't do the Hammurabi Code, that sort of the universe will just disintegrate. And I really think that people have that sensibility is when the scale has gone down because of a wrong deed, we have to right it by another wrong deed. And it's like Gandhi said, eye for eye only makes the whole world blind. I think that's why that's one of the reasons why I think that retributive justice is still so popular.
It does speak almost. It has like it goes right into the main vein, and just an adrenaline shot to the ego, and it feels so good. And I, with all my knowledge and criticism of hell and retributive justice, even I will feel just like, oh my God, I want to do to that person what I want them to make them feel what I'm feeling right now. And it's embarrassing, honestly, to know that that's part of my humanity. But I do agree that what we see happening in Scripture usually is an evolution. There's an unfolding. And what I see happening, at least through the New Testament with Jesus' teachings, and then you get into further with Paul, and especially the book of Hebrews, which reframes a lot of the sacrificial system. And I think what it's trying to do is detach in some ways to say this was the way it used to be. And now now I say to you, love your enemies. And these kinds of lines, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son, that just put justice, that basically it's scandalous. It's almost scandalous because it's so intentionally unjust and unfair, and lavishes grace on the wrongdoer. And that, to me, when I see that is the most attractive part of the Christian message. And I see a lot of other writers who do that as well, yet they still seem to hold on to hell. And they don't make any sense to me, other than the fact that they have to do that because they are still holding on to inerrancy. And I don't get it, man. I just don't get it.
You're talking. I'm getting a little teary-eyed because I'm thinking about one of the great stories of forgiveness that doesn't involve the letting of blood is the story of Joseph at the tail end of Genesis.
Oh my God.
To this day, if I read through that story, I can't do it without crying, because this picture of Joseph, who was a little twit, a little punk, but then his brothers do him dirty, and he ends up through a series of dramatic events, he ends up in Egypt like second in command, and his brothers come to town, and he's trying to shove it in their face and get back at him. And he wants to, it's just a beautiful story. It's unmatched. He's trying to get back at him and level things. And then he can't take it anymore. He sees them. He has to go into the other room when they're dining and wash his face and all that. And he just breaks down. He cannot take it because these are his brothers.
Yeah.
And they're trying to make it right. And Judah is coming back and making it right. When I read that story, I'm like, that is goddamn beautiful.
I know.
And there's no hell. There's no animals being killed. It's just a beautiful story of human reconciliation. And that's what we want. And by the way, hell is, in my opinion, it's like It's a pansy's way out, man. Oh, these people, like, they did us dirty. We're going to torture them eternally. It's like, what about the ongoing attempt to woo these people back to Christianity or to woo them to Christ and his love? You're just going to get rid of them so you don't have to see them or deal with them anymore? That's what a coward that's what a coward does, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I always have found C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, is one of my favorite books. It's the first time I read anything where someone used their imagination in theology. I remember reading that going, oh, we're allowed to do that? We're allowed to reimagine these things? And then he tells the story of heaven and hell in a very completely different metaphors, completely different figurativeness. Sure. But the whole idea is that there are people from heaven who continue to try and woo people into the realness of heaven from the gray world, which is hell. Anyways.
And that's such a beautiful picture. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm gonna close us up here, my friend, because I have a question I would just love to hear you riff on.
Yeah.
Because when we're talking about beliefs and doctrines, and everyone has these, whether they're a religious person or not. Yeah. I've never met anyone, they may not be conscious of it, but I've never met anyone who doesn't have dogma and doctrines, stories, is what I would say, that they are living their life by. And there's this collective agreement that hell is this thing we're all going to believe in. And a lot of people, in my opinion, approach it pretty uncritically. Yeah. Sadly, most people who attend churches or mosques or synagogues or temples, whatever they may be, aren't going there to think critically about what they claim they believe or they're being told to believe. And they're just going along with it, which is a very irresponsible thing, in my opinion. But what if all these Christians just let go of hell? What do you think would happen if collectively everyone just said, you know what, we're going to take a year and we're going to stop believing this and see what happens? What do you think would happen?
Well, the part of the answer to that involves the suggestion that it might also involve letting go of the idea of heaven, which is a kind of a non-starter for people. But let's just say, in my imaginative world, hypothetically, that we could let go for a second of the confidence in what happens after death, right? Like if we just suppose that the only thing that we can feel pretty confident about is that we're alive now and that we're going to die, most likely. Statistically, that seems likely. But we don't know what happened. We don't know what happens afterward. We don't know what happens afterward. So if we didn't have that confidence, then we might try to create heaven on earth right now to the best of our ability and eradicate any iterations of hell that we find around us for our own benefit and for the benefit of other people. I think that's the great challenge. Listen, as an atheist, but someone who's deeply informed by the Bible, it is not a great thought sometimes to think about, man, maybe this is all there is. Maybe there isn't an afterlife. It doesn't feel great. I think the evidence points in that direction. That's what I think is most likely, is that when we die, that's it. But so I don't love that thought, but that thought does make me think I would like to enjoy life as much as possible, given this is the only one that I probably have, and I like to help other people as well. One thing I do not see this across the board with Christians, but I do think there are a lot of Christians who are willing to punt issues, cultural issues of importance to the afterlife. God will sort it out, right? We don't have to figure it out right now, because now and again, there's a lot of Christians who are into social justice and who are into anticipating the kingdom in the here and now in some very meaningful and powerful ways. But to the extent that some Christians are punting those important cultural progressions into eternity, I think that's a real opportunity lost. And I think the interesting cultural project is going to be what will happen when more and more people sort of at least put us to the side a strong belief in the afterlife one way or the other, and get serious about doing things right now. I think that's very, very exciting to see those possibilities.
What do you think of Jordan Peterson's idea that losing hell might unleash hell?
Yeah, he's Jordan Peterson is losing hell would unleash. I think he's deeply afraid of what happens to people when that happens. But just as a quick anecdote, this maybe isn't super scientific, but countries around the world, like Scandinavian countries, there are other countries that I could mention as well, but Scandinavian countries where strong fundamentalist belief in God is at an all-time low, is vanishingly rare. These aren't countries that are cannibalizing themselves. In fact, they're some of the happiest and most successful countries in the world. Now, I'm not going to say that it's because they're not strong Christians there, but it is an interesting correlation. And these are not countries where people are spending time each day dwelling on the reality of eternal punishment. They're not. And yet they seem to be doing fine. But Jordan Peterson is deeply worried about that. I'm not. I think if you have to motivate people to behave well by threatening them with eternal punishment, then what you're dealing with is adolescent morality. We ought to grow up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a deep need for people to believe that life makes sense, that if you do XYZ, named behaviors that are supposedly moral, virtuous, or good, then XYZ happens to you. Good things happen. Mm-hmm. And we know that is not always the case. There may be a tendency for good things to come back to us, but there is also a whole lot of absurdity in this plane of existence that we call creation. And so that is very difficult for people to deal with. So it's helpful, I think, for a lot of people psychologically to go, well, there's a very strong, rigid system after we die that will make sense of all the nonsense that we're doing. And so that to me is, I think, where a lot of it comes from. And if we can calm people down to take a couple breaths, maybe, whatever if you still believe in heaven and or hell, maybe believe in it in a less, certain way, or soften what that may look like. Find a way to bring those into the here and now, almost like having windows on your house. You bring the light in, bring in your views of eternity into the here and now, and how can you combat your stories and mythologies around hell, and how can you celebrate and cultivate your stories and mythologies of heaven? I think that would be maybe the most powerful thing people of faith could do.
Yes, agreed.
Okay, any final words, Trent? Someone comes up to you tomorrow, you're walking around, and they stop you. Hey, sir, I just need to know, if you were to die tonight, where would you go?
Hopefully a reasonably elegant and also affordable cemetery.
Oh, elegant and affordable. I love it.
Yeah. If I died I wouldn't go anywhere. I might be carried somewhere, but certainly I would be going nowhere after that event. That's what I think. Yeah.
I'm not dead
because
yet.
No place called hell has ever yet been identified using radar, LiDAR, anything.
Technology will get us there, Trent.
I know it will. It's only a matter of time.
Well, friends, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation about us not giving a damn about hell. Welcome, and I hope you come back and check us out. Trent, how can people learn more about us and leave us some messages?
Yes, so if you want to reach out to us directly, our email address is leadballoonspodcast@gmail.com. So we'd love to hear from you. If you have ideas for podcasts, you want to hear about a certain topic, or just general feedback, you can leave it there. Leadballoonspod.com is our website. It's kind of a hub there. We've got Joel and I are both doing weekly blogs there. You'll see one from me one week, one from Joel the next week. And then and you can listen to episodes there as well as learn more about us. And we are also at Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and we do have videos available on YouTube. And you can also comment on the YouTube channel as well. So please connect with us. Please share the podcast with anyone you think might benefit from it.
Awesome. Thank you, my friend, and thank you everyone who's a part. Appreciate you guys.